Thank you for tuning in once again to his Vine and Fig Tree podcast. My name is Kurt Olson. I'm your host, coming to you on the morning of July 22nd, 2026. And a little bit of talk here this morning about communists in the Democratic Party, a communist in our own hemisphere, and how they're reacting to things. And then JD Vance. Want to share some just some observations and some perspective regarding our vice president. So Van Jones, who is a contributor on CNN, he is someone who is a regular voice there. He recently went to his own Substack and went off on the Democratic Socialists of America that are in the Democratic Party. And he really doesn't have a lot of good things to say. And he doesn't like their ideas. And I think Democrats down deep know that their connection with these people is going to end up hurting their brand. So what you end up having is Bill Maher, the comedian on HBO, who strangely has become one of the voices of reason in the Democratic Party. That started really during COVID and it has kind of extended out to now. And Van Jones, or I'm sorry, Bill Maher, he's basically telling people he is his vote is up for grabs in 2028. Um, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because we can only guess that there's going to be more coming from that. And then you have Van Jones. Van Jones just cannot, has no time for these communists who have ideas that range from let's get rid of police, let's get rid of prisons, certainly let's not put rapists and murderers in prison. And while we're at it, let's reject the state of Israel right to exist. And these ideas are things he has no time for. And while the ideas that Van Jones does accept, like universal health care, free education, um, uh, Green New Deal, I have legitimate policy issues with all of that because they cost a lot. They put too much power in the hands of government and will end up hurting the country long term, financially and otherwise. Not to mention the hurting of Americans when it comes to healthcare, as they now have healthcare, if not rationed, at least waiting lines will exist for a variety of procedures that are commonplace. And our healthcare would look more like Canada, parts of Europe. And we have people in this country that just love that idea, but unfortunately, it's it doesn't end well in terms of benefiting Americans health wise. So there's all of that going on. And Bill Maher and Van Jones, I think they realize, and we've seen it from James Carville recently as well, they know the DSA is going to hurt the brand. And Bernie Sanders and AOC were recently in Michigan praising the virtues of Abdul El Said, and it's going to be very interesting to see how many more communists end up being elected this cycle as nominees for Democrats. So that is to yet to play out. And then just yesterday, I saw this, and I don't know when this happened. I don't know if it was over the weekend. I don't know if it was Monday, whatever. But Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua, communist leader of Nicaragua, out of the blue announces no more elections. Yep, we're done. And his reason, the reason he's doing it is because there are populists that are winning elections throughout Central and South America, and to a point where he's certain that he would be next. And it gives you a tell when they're on the verge of losing power, it's time to change the rules. And so that's what's going on in Nicaragua. And we have a past there that goes back to the late '80s, caused a lot of turmoil for Reagan in his last years in office. Um, but JD Vance, JD Vance has gotten a fair amount of attention recently because he was part of the negotiating team in the ceasefire talks with Iran. He was at the Nixon Presidential Library for an sit down interview. And he also recently was on the Joe Rogan show. And there's a lot of people right of center who love the idea of voting for JD Vance in 2028. Well, I don't. And the more I see of this guy, the less I like. And let's just start with some background. So, JD Vance, uh, the U.S. Senator in office a grand total of 2 years, 2 years, when he was named vice president for Donald Trump. And it was really down to two people, JD Vance and Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio, long term senator from Florida, has a strong legislative history and past and grasp of a lot of things in foreign policy and otherwise. And Marco Rubio also ran for president in 2016. And then Charlie Kirk and others pushed the name of JD Vance in front of Donald Trump. And JD Vance becomes a nominee. And I believe one of the unspoken reasons for that happening was because Trump has a residence in Florida. He would be bumping up against the rule of the nominee and the vice presidential nominee being from different states. And my guess is there was a wink, wink, nod, nod given to Marco Rubio. You do your thing, and we'll get you in the administration really fast upon the time I'm elected president. So all of that happens. But JD Vance fundamentally has a wrong view of Iran and Israel and a lot of things. When it came time for the ceasefire talks, I believe he has way too much faith in a regime that has not earned the right to have faith and trust and credibility put in them. They've been at war with the United States for 47 years, period. They have killed thousands of Americans, period. And when you have the best opportunity in 5 decades to take out a regime that's been causing so much conflict for you and others and allies around the world, you do it and you don't stop. You keep your foot on the gas and you go. And JD Vance helped convince Trump to do a ceasefire. And that ceasefire lasted about 3 months. So there's that. But JD Vance, and there's been some talk and reporting on this, but not nearly enough. But JD Vance has um, a view of the world where China can have control in its area, Russia can have control in its area, and thank you very much, America will control the Western Hemisphere and we'll take care of our backyard. Well, the problem is, for me, is that view of the world really doesn't account for the mischief that the CCP not only has been doing, but is doing right now in our country and elsewhere. It disregards the mischief that Russia has been doing in Ukraine and would greatly do elsewhere if they weren't overextended in Ukraine right now. And I don't believe America should be the police of the world, but I do believe there are moments in time when we do need to stand up for human rights when they are being messed with. And it's one of the reasons why I support what we started doing in Iran. They massacred tens of thousands of their own citizens, and that's after they killed close to 15, 20,000 people in their own country who were political prisoners and had X number of thousand more in jail because of their politics. So that's part of the JD Vance worldview that I have an issue with. But he was at the Nixon Library and he is being interviewed about his book about coming back to faith. Great. He was an evangelical, turned to atheism in his early 20s, and then came back to faith and he converted to Catholicism. Now, I wouldn't have converted to Catholicism. Uh, that's a totally different podcast episode. Not going there. But he said a lot of things in this sit down interview at the Nixon Library that most Christ followers could appreciate and agree with. And then it got opened up. And he started talking about Nixon and Reagan. And so JD Vance is explaining how there have been two great landslides in the Republican Party in the last, 50 plus years. You had the Reagan landslide in 1984, and Reagan also had a landslide in 1980, so there was two. And then you had the Nixon landslide in 1972 when he was reelected. And JD Vance goes on to say that Ronald Reagan built his coalition by increasing the number of whites that came to the Reagan Revolution. And he went on to say that Reagan wouldn't have been able to have been elected in 2024. And when I heard that, I'm like, okay, he's only analyzing this from pure politics, an election. And you don't know what kind of appeal Ronald Reagan would have had with minorities in 2024 had he been alive to run for office. You don't know that. You don't know that at all. You don't know how he would have appealed to. See, rural voters back in the 1980s tended to be hard Democrats, and over time they have shifted. And you don't know what kind of appeal Ronald Reagan would have had to rural voters in 1980 or 1984 or even 2024 if he was alive to run. And if if JD Vance is sitting there making the case that Nixon was a greater president than Ronald Reagan. Sorry, dude. It's not that it's a non-starter with me, but it's just a perspective of history that is like just shockingly bad. I mean, Ronald Reagan should be on the Mount Rushmore of Republican presidents. And I'm not sure Nixon makes it, frankly. Um, and you go back and you revisit the 70s, and there were some economic policies by Richard Nixon that were not good for the country. And some of the things in the late Nixon years laid the groundwork for the things that unfolded in the Carter years with economic turmoil. So those were not good years. Um, and I mean, okay, Reagan was out of office when the Berlin Wall fell, but he has every right to take responsibility for it because he looked communism in the eye, called it an evil empire, and he did that at every turn. And Reagan is the most consequential president of my lifetime. Um, with the second place coming to Barack Obama, and that wasn't in a good way. And so I, that's just the way it is. And if there is a group of people in this country who are trying to resurrect Nixon at the expense of Ronald Reagan, I will not be on that train. I will not be on that boat. You will not get my ticket. I will not be on it. So there's that. And then you get to Joe Rogan interview, and we just get more of this blame Israel stuff. And I'm sorry, when the Nick Fuentes controversy unfolded with Tucker Carlson last fall, and Nick Fuentes was praising who was it? Joseph Stalin and Mao, and sorry, no, and JD Vance really didn't come out with a critical perspective on what unfolded there. And I think he was willing to let the Nick Fuentes thing kind of die and just lose energy and really not be critical of it, when it was a moment in the Republican Party where moral clarity was needed, and people speaking out and saying our party is not going here. No. And because otherwise you get what's happening in the Democratic Party right now with communists. So um, those are those are big things about JD Vance that I have big problems with. And it's one of those things where uh, if this guy is the nominee in 2028, for the third time in recent years, I will not be voting for a Republican. And I have been basically a free agent for over a decade now, well over a decade. It's probably been a dozen or so years. I've just changed my perspective on who gets my vote. And I want people of character. I want people who their character is their guiding influence. And I also saw some comments that JD Vance made about the private and public sector that just really bother me, because I can go through the county where I am now sitting in, Chautauqua County, New York, and I can find family owned businesses in all kinds of places. And they don't have the kind of influence on the government that JD Vance seems to think business has in Washington, D.C. And he just has a perspective on some things that I just, sorry, no, don't pass go, don't collect $200, all of it. And but that's where I stand right now. I would really like to see Ron DeSantis run again. He's been saying some things in Florida that make me think that he has every intention of running for president again. I think Marco Rubio would make a great president, and I could support him. So there's a lot to play out there, but JD Vance has been too much in the news recently to avoid talking about him. So that's all I have this week. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. For those who listen to this podcast and read my column, thank you for doing so. Anyone who shares, thank you for doing so and doing so in advance. And until next time, God bless.